Good afternoon. I'm Alejandra Valarino Boyer, Director of Programs and Partnerships at Seattle Opera. I am delighted to welcome you all to today's community conversation, The View from the Pit, Maestros on Gender and Race in Opera. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to acknowledge that Seattle Opera, along with the people we serve, live and work on the land of the Coast Salish peoples. We recognize that this acknowledgement is only a first step in showing recognition and respect for the Indigenous peoples who have been and continue to be stewards of this land. As noted on duwamishtribe.org, a land acknowledgement is a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. Acknowledgement is a beginning to resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories and working towards honoring and inviting the truth. I hope that you'll take this moment to reflect on your own relationships with these truths and seek to further your commitment to supporting and honoring the work of Native communities and nations. Our conversation today features an incredibly talented group of conductors discussing their role as artists, addressing racism and sexism in our field, and looking forward to the future of opera. As people of color, our panelists have generously offered to engage in this conversation, and I want to acknowledge the additional emotional labor that they are taking on in doing so. The Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism group defines emotional labor as the need for one group to regulate their emotions to satisfy another group, usually the group holding the most power. I want to thank our panelists on behalf of Seattle Opera for adding to your emotional labor by being in conversation with us today. Throughout the course of our conversation, we invite you, the audience, to ask questions utilizing the Q&A button on your screen. We will also allow time for questions at the end of our chat. As a reminder, this conversation aims to create space for discussions on race, gender, and equity with the goal of undoing systems of oppression. Our community conversations operate under the foundation that racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression are real, and they show up in opera and the arts every day. Rather than debating these truths or providing an introduction to equity in opera, we aim to create a space where our panelists can speak as candidly and authentically as they wish to. We will not be able to get to every question, but we're going to try, and we'll lean into difficult questions, even if they challenge our own perspectives. However, we are not going to address questions which aim to cause further hurt or harm. We invite you to visit Seattle Opera's Commitment to Equity page on our website for additional information and resources, and you should see the link in your chat. And now we get on to our conversation for today. I'm going to break from the traditional opening of the panel and skip the bios as we make these introductions. If you'd like to see the formal bios, please visit the event link, and that link should also be up in your chat momentarily. Unfortunately, Alejandra de la Parra is unable to be with us today due to illness, so we wish her a speedy recovery. I've asked the panelists to introduce themselves by telling us how they define themselves as artists and opera conductors, to tell us how they define their artistry and what their role is in the storytelling of opera. Viswa, I'd like to start with you in the introductions.
Of course.
Because you were unmuted, that's why.
See, I knew I should have hit that mute button.
Hey, there you
my
go.
name is Viswa Subbaraman. I'm currently located in Houston, Texas, which is my home base. To define myself as an artist, I think generally I think of myself as a musician. I don't think of myself necessarily as a conductor because our roles are so varied in how we actually have to work with people. And so I've always just thought of myself as a musician. And my role as a conductor, this is something that I think about all the time. I'm not sure I even have a definition these days. But I think the simplistic way I look at it is my hope is that I do my job in a way that helps put people in a position to succeed. You know, we're facilitators more than we are, you know, people think of us as, you know, we lead everything, but more, I think realistically what we do is we try and get people in a position to create great art. Because we don't make a sound. We're the only people who are musicians who make no sounds, you know? So we have to put the people who actually make the sound of the art form that we create in a position to create great art. So that's how I try and look at my position.
I love that, that's excellent. Thank you, Viswa. Kazem, we'll go to you next. Oh, and you're on mute, Kazem. You know, we're gonna be in person soon. We will be beyond our mute buttons, I hope.
Yes.
There we go.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, my name is Kazem Abdullah, and I guess I would define my artistry as a conductor. like Viswa, I first identify also sort of first as a musician, but I would say that as a conductor, I guess you're always sort of striving for excellence and discipline and sort of fostering innovation. And I guess as a conductor, you're setting the pace and building and resolving tension and transforming potential cacophony into hopefully what would be melodious harmony, or in some cases, maybe even organized cacophony. And I guess I seek to sort of do this all in my unique and personal style. And so, yeah, and I would say, the artistry of a conductor is kind of just, it's kind of an engaged artistry. And, that is the ability to sort of articulate and embody and connect with others with a specific purpose in mind. So for example, the part of the artistry of a conductor, I think, is to sort of mobilize a following towards a shared purpose. And so that's kind of how I view the role of a conductor.
Excellent, thank you. It's so interesting.
Or my artistry as a conductor.
Yeah, of course. No, your commentary along with Viswa's, and excited to hear what Judith has to add to that. But it's interesting to hear you both define your art really in terms of characteristic, personality, and leadership, really, which is an interesting turn as we think of what an artist is and what art is. So I love it. Judith, would love to hear from you.
Hi. First of all, I have to say to my two colleagues, that was so beautifully put. That was wonderful. My name is Judith Yan, and actually in an ordinary year, my season is perfectly divided amongst opera, ballet, and symphony. And it's designed in that way because I can't help it. I couldn't choose. Like, I loved all three mediums. And for me, it's almost like it's a fantastic cross training, right? Because each of these mediums require a different set of skills. And I think it's a mix of these three art forms that define the way I approach work. And for me, conducting has always been about the work. I mean, it's a job. To me, it's a job, but it's a really great job. I'm surrounded by beauty all day long, like visual beauty, oral beauty, and always on my mind, my job to the audience, is really just to entertain you, and maybe to unlock a feeling or perhaps a secret that, you were never aware of. And I agree with my colleagues that my role, to my colleagues there in the pit and of course on stage, is much more straightforward. I'm here to give you the best show I can and to hopefully get you rehired.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Judith. And thank you for adding that your work does encompass more than just opera with ballet and symphony and Viswa and Kazem. You also work beyond opera to doing symphonic work as well. So that's wonderful. So our conversation today, it's so interesting because we walked in, the team who works on these at Seattle Opera really thinking about, well, let's get this wonderful group of conductors together to really dig into this conversation around race and gender and what that means. And I think it's worth saying out loud to the folks viewing that as we entered into kind of our pre-meeting, right? I'm giving away the secret here is that we do actually meet beforehand to talk a little bit about this, but that each of you really spoke so much about your desire to be hired as the artist that you are and to do the work that it is that you seek to do, right? And so we really took that and heard that. And so I do think for the conversation today, we really do want to talk around the issues of racism and sexism, to hear how that has impacted, if it's impacted your work, but then to move beyond that really and to see, where are the points in which you feel you're doing your best work and what are the things that create that atmosphere and what is it you see as a future for this. So that'll be how we'll take our conversation forward, and starting with issues of oppressions. Throughout this past year, more artists have been, or I guess artists have been more outspoken about the racism and sexism that they have encountered, continue to encounter in their careers. And that's not to say that this is a new thing that's just happened. It has been there, it has always been there, but our current events have put us in a place for folks to feel that they can speak out more candidly about this. And so for the three of you here, who may have had similar experiences, how has that changed the way that you approach your work, or has it? What has been the impact of those moments in your work as a conductor?
Do you mean the impact that the moments of racism have had on us as artists, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I think, as you know, I want to center this in your roles as conductor, but I am also, as I say that, I'm really aware that we can't separate ourselves from that, right? So there are things, the oppressions that we encounter in our everyday lives that also bleed into what we do as artists or as professionals. But as we think around some of the systemic issues in our industry, some of the specifically inequities around race and gender, how has that impacted how you do your work, how you move around in the work that you do, or has it just not, or do you kind of refuse to let that seep in?
I mean, you try to refuse to not let it seep in, you know? I think for me, it's been the places I've seen it the most for me are from the perspective of the types of work I get offered, and the pigeonholing of being a minority conductor and being tasked with doing all the minority work, you know, because there's a feeling that, you know, I guess in a good way, in a sense, in that there is more work for minorities because of this, but opera companies have been adding more minority oriented work to their seasons. Now, whether it's always good or not is a whole other discussion. But there's a lot of like chamber work, et cetera. And to be the pigeonholing for me has been the biggest issue with that, in that seems to be mostly what I get offered with companies, when I would love to do a Traviata or I would love to do a Bohème, you know? And I think that's the biggest issue. And I think maybe secondarily, and I don't know whether my colleagues would agree, it's changed my leadership style. You can't conduct or rehearse like a white male conductor. You have to find different ways to say things, because people either think you're uppity or think you're angry or think you're, you know, a certain way if you use certain language that my white male colleagues have used and have no problems using, you know? So I think you find ways to lead from within, and you find ways to lead with more compassion in a sense, you know, because you have to.
Yeah, I guess one thing for me, I guess I would just say is it has not really, like, you know, of course, yeah, I mean, racism exists in sort of all segments and all parts of the society, I think worldwide. So it doesn't really matter where you are in the world, on either side of the whatever racial spectrum exists where you are. But I would say it hasn't really changed how I personally work and approach my work. But I would say it's changed how I've been in the last years, just much more selective about what I choose to do. And like generally, like I kind of like at a certain point, I just like made the conscious decision to try to avoid working with organizations that don't really care about me as an artist and what my interests are and how I would like to develop as well. Being that I'm a young conductor that also has to get a certain amount of repertoire learned and a certain amount of experience. And so, and I guess I realized sort of early in my conducting, or early in my quote unquote conducting career, I guess you could say, is that it's kind of easy to be, this sounds maybe a little bit crass, it's kind of easy to be used where an artistic organization sort of seeks to engage you for things other than your repertoire strengths and your interests. And I just realized when I had accepted certain kinds of things that like it was sometimes more about the optics rather than the actual artistic and musical experience that had to happen. So I've just kind of, as I've gotten older, I've been sort of much more selective and about what I decide to do. So that's how I would say that's maybe how it's affected my work in a way, but how I actually do the work as a conductor, how I work with musicians, that it has, I don't feel that has actually changed for me being a Black conductor.
Judith, how about from you?
Well, it's interesting what Kazem, what you just said. I did remember at the beginning, the start of the career, I said yes to everything. big companies, small companies, whatever. I just
Yeah,
said
you have to, and yeah, like at a certain
Yeah.
point, you do have to just get the experience. Yeah,
and
yeah.
on, right? Then you are more selective because you're given a chance to learn what speaks to you or what you're good at, or what carries the most weight for you. And what Viswa said was interesting about how I do recognize that in certain situations they will approach, like other artists might approach me as a conductor in a different way. Perhaps they don't feel they have to be, they can be a bit more casual. So it's always a struggle in my head, like, how do I deal with this? Do I behave as my mentors would have behaved? How well would that go? Or do I stick to my guns and say, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. But I mean, I've been very lucky. Perhaps I haven't had, I know I've had, we all have had negative experiences, right? And I thought really long and hard about this question because it's a very good question. And the truth is, I actually just ignored it. And by ignoring this behavior, I don't mean I'm ignoring its existence. I think that the skills that were required to do this job are huge. It takes decades to figure out exactly what you're doing and how to do it. And during this time, I've never had time to take note of the offenses, right? So if something was rude, and that happens, right? I'm not denying it. I never thought, oh my goodness, I'm so oppressed, right? Instead, I always think, like my parents always taught me from the very beginning, human beings are quixotic, right? And they're also beautifully flawed, right? So if we weren't flawed and weak, then, well, you wouldn't have any opera, really, right? This is what human beings are. I mean, they could at one moment be incredibly kind and the next moment be utterly wretched. So I never worried about it. I focused on the work. I'm not saying that I'm accepting it. I'm just saying that, this is the world, this is the game, and figure out how to get what you need under these parameters and conditions.
It is nice reaching a point where you can say no. That has been the nicest thing about reaching this age in my life, is when I could finally turn work down.
Well, what's the turning point for that, right? Because each of you spoke to that, but you were all very emphatic on the, when you start out, you have to take everything on. I think that's true of a lot of professions, right? I mean, I'll think of my own early career I said yes to every single project, right? Every single event, everything that I could do just to learn. From your perspective as conductors, where is that turning point? Where is that turning point where you can either start to be more selective? Where is that turning point where you can, well, Viswa, you talked about understanding how you have to communicate differently. And I'm going to put words in your mouth by saying, I think for me, that's also how to speak like yourself, but do it in a way that's, that's you in this space. But tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth. So
but I think there's also a way I think there's a way women and minorities are looked at, right? Like adjectives used with women are often like shrill or, and they're not doing anything different than any other person would do. You know what I mean? It's an approach when you're in a position of leadership, when you're not seen as the normal person in that leadership position. And most of us figure out how to work around it and then don't think about it again, but it is kind of a fascinating question. We look at it, it's not just here, it's in sports. When you look at like minority coaches in the NFL, why is it taking so long? Minority quarterbacks in the NFL, why is that taking so long? Right. And so these are questions of like people moving into leadership positions that I think is it's interesting to hear how people are described. I mean, we heard this about Hillary Clinton all the time. She's shrill, she's angry. She didn't really say anything different than the person she was running against. You know what I mean? Like the tone was not in any way different, but somehow she was put in that position. So I do think we have to kind of think about that when we look at people in leadership positions, especially when it comes to women and minorities, on what that perception is, Yeah,
absolutely. And go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, I am in agreement. And I also have to add that it's an incredibly difficult and very competitive field. And, going back to human beings and the nature of human beings, and we're deeply flawed, right? We will instinctively do anything to assume an advantage. So I have worked for, and wonderful, wonderful conductors who fit the so-called norm, and and yet I have heard like horrendous things being said about them. So you really can't win. I mean, you can look like Daniel Craig, doesn't matter, right? So I think it goes back to, for me, since I'm just going to ignore the noise. Because there are times, no matter what how well you do, it may not turn out. And sometimes you could make mistakes left, right, and center, and you come out smelling glorious. It's, you just don't know. And I think that's what's so interesting about this profession.
True.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's I'm not a conductor, and I'm like, yeah, for sure. But hearing from all of you, and of course, being in the opera industry, it is highly competitive, right? And people will say what they will. I want to maybe push back a little bit though, and to kind of Viswa's point is, is it harder though for people of color and for women? I mean, is there a bar that is set higher than for white colleagues? And you can disagree. This is not a leading question for you to agree or with me. It's an honest question of, these are the two sides of the conversations, right? Of around race and how it shows up. I mean, have you felt in your work that there is a higher standard for you coming in as a person of color or as a woman than there was for anybody who, for your white colleague who's coming in through the door?
I would say that, the actual, what I would say this is that it's actually hard for anyone, white, black, Asian, Indian, whatever, it's hard for anyone to become a conductor, and it's a globally competitive thing. And it's actually hard it's a hard job for anyone to sort of enter, and a hard job for anyone to sort of maintain a career over many, many years, no matter what your race or gender and so I would like to first say that. But I think that there is a kind of, I would say that sometimes what I've seen is that there's sometimes a double standard as far as having the room to make mistakes and to bounce back from them, or to get a second chance or third chance or fourth chance. And that, I think that's where I see the big separation. I don't really, it really is hard for everyone. But I find that probably amongst minority conductors and women conductors, that there's more of there's maybe sometimes a double standard in that sense, where it's like, oh, you've messed up, and then I don't want to say you're just done. Everyone can bounce back from adversity, but I found that minority and women conductors maybe don't get that second chance, that third chance. And then that's what I think, just from my observations of how the field kind of is.
And to add to what Kazem said, I agree 100%. And also, like, people forget that we can't learn or practice our job without having people in front of us. I mean, like, you can sit there and conduct a mirror all day, but that doesn't do anything for you. It's standing in front of musicians and trying to make music happen that's really where you learn. And I've seen a lot of people fail up. It's very hard for a young minority conductor to fail up early in their career. So when you think about it, when we first start, when the first time you stand in front of a professional orchestra, you're literally working and practicing at the same time. When, eons ago when I started, and less eons ago when Kazem started, and even fewer eons ago when Judith started, we're talking about, like, you're standing in front of a professional orchestra having gotten your degree, and this is not something that, like, you always hit the ground running on, And I agree with Kazem. I think it's more difficult for minorities if you don't hit the ground running well at the beginning, to kind of continue to keep getting reinvited. And that first time you ever conduct a professional orchestra, you're kind of hanging on for dear life. I mean, it's a different kind of situation than it is when you're doing your master's, or you're standing in front of students, that you're going to hit the bar with later, And so I think from that perspective, I agree with 100% with Kazem. But I also would say that, like, 99% of the time, I feel like every time I've been in the room, which is like working with singers, working with an orchestra, I don't feel like they care. I think their only concern is, can I do my job well enough to make them sound good. You know, and I feel like that's the demand from an orchestra, that's the demand from singers. And again, I say this all the time, the happiest I ever am and the least I ever think about myself is when I'm in front of an orchestra, because it's just really about doing the work and making music. And that's really what I've never really felt like it was a race issue when you're standing there. I think it's always a question of, are you good enough to do this? And that's justified. You know, we have a lot on our shoulders to get them through, you know, so I feel like it's getting the jobs, continuing the career, building a career. That's where the challenges are as a minority. I don't feel like actually being in the room and making the music has ever been a question of me being a minority. For me,
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with my two colleagues. You know, at the end of the day, all they care about is, do you bring the production under budget? Do you do a good job? Did you make us money?
Did you not go into overtime?
Exactly. You go over time. That's the gravest sin. And did you do your job? I think that's true. And I do agree as well that this job is so hard and so complicated and takes so long to learn to do that it is necessary for us to be incompetent many times over, because each time you get another chance of being competent, you become less incompetent. So I think it's that may be where there may be not so much equity, but I think for me personally, I've been very lucky. I had 3 tremendously amazing mentors, and I feel because of the discussions that we're having right now, I have to say that they were white European males, and they never looked at me any differently. They never cut me any slack. They were always honest with me, and I think 2 of them. In the end, they were more disappointed that other people didn't take on and continue giving the opportunities as they have. And they are, of course, you know, very, as was I, grateful to the organizations that was that forward thinking, was that open-minded, and you know, gave all of us a chance.
I'm really struck by your comments around the openness of the folks that you've had the opportunity to work with, the artists that you've been able to work with, right? The art makers that you've been able to work with, right? And I think that's really key and critical to continue to have that, and to be able to allow for more young artists and artists of color and female conductors to be able to step into those spaces. I think Viswa, you said something around there's one of those points where maybe that's where things start to get shaky, is those early opportunities and how to get there, and getting those. I mean, then what is your, I don't know, what's your words of advice, inspiration to any young artist or conductor who is a person of color or a female conductor who's saying, boy, there aren't that many people out there who look like me who are doing this thing, and I just don't know how I'm gonna get in and do, right? I mean, I feel like you've sprinkled a lot of words of wisdom already throughout this, but you know, is there anything further that you would say to those young artists?
Oh man.
I wouldn't give. I wouldn't give different advice to someone. Actually, like to any young person, I would just say, no matter where you're from, that you should really only do this if you really love music. And I think that's actually like the guiding force. And so I think if you really love it, you'll find ways to persevere even through like big disappointments and stuff like this. If you really love the art form and it's something you want to have in your life, you know, sometimes people just have to do different things. You know, we just got out of a pandemic where many people had to do different things, myself included. So it's that would be the advice that I would give. And I would say, I mean, try not to give give the space of racism too much room in your mind. Of course, address it and be cognizant of it, and but don't let it try not to let it bog you down too much if that's possible. I know that's kind of maybe in some ways empty words, but sometimes that's what you have to do. You just gotta, yeah, you know, like as one famous politician, sometimes you have to fake it until you make it. And there's a certain amount of that.
Yep. You know, I tell every single person who asks me that question, I literally look at them and say, if there's anything else in life you can do that will bring you joy, you should do that and not do music. Because I think the musicians who I know who have made it literally have to do it. They have no choice. The career is so hard. You're rejected so much when you're coming up in the business. The money is so little when you first start. I mean, I worked 3 jobs and started an opera company to be able to do this. You know what I mean? Because at a certain point, like I'd worked with Kurt Mazur and I couldn't get gigs, you know, when I came back to the States. And so I started an opera company, and it basically was kind of like, screw you guys, I'm going to do this because I'm going to do this, right? And if you don't have the mentality where you're just going to keep hitting the wall and walking through it, you're not going to make it. It just won't happen. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white or brown. It just doesn't matter. It's hard. It's a ridiculously difficult career to actually have a career and make money doing it. And so I tell everybody, if there's anything else that will bring you joy, you should do that. You'll have a happier life than if you just want to do music. I don't think you can want to do music. You have to do music, and you might have a career, you know. And then even then, you have to hope the brakes hit.
I agree with both of my colleagues. If this art form speaks to you, you just have to do it. And I agree, you have to really love it, or else, because it's really difficult. And you know, and also you have to show up, right? In terms of like what we're trying to talk about today, right? In this particular event, is at 90% of it, this challenge that we think we face is you just need to show up, because by showing up, you're kind of affecting change in a very quiet sort of way, right? So I think the idea that change, for everyone happening overnight, if you constantly believe that change is going to happen overnight, this is setting up all of us up for a really big disappointment, because I don't think that's how life goes. It's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I really believe that's the price of doing business, right? So maybe you've got days where it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Regardless, you showed up, and eventually, we're really not. We're not only are we showing up by doing this for us because we love it. We can't help but doing. We can't do anything else. But we are also, I think, more importantly, showing up for the next generation. Because I can't imagine 100 years ago, not even doing this, but having a conversation with all of you, being allowed to say certain things out loud. It's astonishing. So
it's so true. You also have to have a little bit of cluelessness and a little bit of fearlessness. I mean, when I started, had I known this is what the career was going to be, I'm not sure I'd have done it.
Let's repeat that. You said cluelessness.
Oh yeah, you have to not know what this is going to be when you first start, because this road is not fun for a long time, and I just didn't know. I put my application in places I didn't deserve to be, and luckily won auditions because I was too stupid to know I wasn't ready to do that. But hey, and like Kazem said earlier, there's a little bit of faking it and then hoping no one caught you. Like, it's cluelessness and fearlessness help a lot at the beginning of this career.
That's excellent. I think that is sage advice for anybody. I'm going to start borrowing that. So let's look forward, right? That forward movement, the 2 steps forward. And actually, Viswa, you mentioned this in one of your prior comments around the joy of being in the room, right? And Judith, you talked about this when we met earlier about being in the room is a place where you can cut out the other noise, right? Where you can go in and do your work. So in the room, you're talking about that rehearsal room, that performance space. So Judith, I'm going to start with you because you had talked about this so beautifully when we met earlier. What is it about that space that's so special? What is it that you love about being in the room and just having everything else tune out so that you can focus on the art and the music that you love?
Yeah, wow, cut out all that noise, eh? I think in this art form, like in the rehearsal room, that, you know, where we just repeat things over and over again. I mean, how many times in our lives have we wondered, like, what would happen if I take the fork to the left as opposed to the right? And in the rehearsal room, you have this opportunity, right? I think especially in opera, you have an opportunity to live another life, right? All the time, to be somebody else. And that's a great thing, right? About those moments in the room. You know, with my colleagues, all of us, we get to live another life, because every production is its own self-contained universe. And most of us, and this I think happens especially in rehearsals or really long runs versus 15 shows, because most of us only get to experience one life. But my colleagues and I, we get to experience so many, because like as a conductor, I get to be Tosca and Scarpia, right? I could be Iago, Otello, and Desdemona. And I think that's the magic of being in the room. My colleagues and I, and we're all friends, we're sitting here and we can let our imaginations go wild. And as my colleagues have said, you know, all that matters is that you do your best, right? Do your best job. In that moment, it's where you're from, who you are, what you ate, you know, you're no longer you, right? In a funny way, you are something greater because you're doing this with a whole bunch of like-minded people. And I think that's what's so phenomenal about this art form and the way we do this art form.
Yeah, what I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with Judith. It's kind of one of these things when you're rehearsing a piece or when you're working on a piece with people, you're kind of are in this mind space of the imagination and fantasy and drama, and that's actually both in opera and in symphonic music. Yeah, like, you know, like I remember, there was a writer called Charles Rosen, and I heard him speak once, and he said there is drama in Sonata 4, which is true. And so, like, you know, whenever you're thinking about music and the trajectory of it, that's kind of what I mean. If you're doing your job as a conductor, you're thinking about the arc of whatever you're doing, and there's actually only space for that to do it. So yeah, that, and how do you make it better? How do I make what's going on better? How do I get everyone into the same frame of mind and the same world? That's what we're thinking about, I think.
And Viswa, what does it mean for you to be in that room?
Oh man, I mean, we get to work with such geniuses. You know, we get to work with Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. We work with them, right? As conductors, we spend so much time studying their work. You know, we try and get so inside it that it almost feels like they're there with you when you're on the podium doing their work, because it's that important to get it right. You know, and there's no actual right. You know, it's how we've interpreted what we hear, how much we can get it to be this like internal recording that we've put together off the score. And we get to work with beauty. I mean, we get to create beauty, and we get to create it with other people who are also aiming for the same kind of inspiration, right? Mm-hmm. And if we do it right, then the people, when we finally get it on stage and, you know, in a performance, the audience feels it too, you know. And that sforzando is not just a sforzando marked on the page. It's a kick to the gut, or it's a drop of a sound that like just makes you feel something, you know. It just, yeah, we get to do it as a team with so many great people. It's in the room is like when you get to clean it up and fix it and try something, and a little bit, maybe a little accelerando here, even though it's not marked, is going to give us that feeling that we're going for in the drama that Kazem is talking about. You know, and I agree. I think there is drama in sonata form. You know, it's funny. I had a teacher once who was like, well, you just conduct the piece, right? And we never really bonded, because I could never really understand what he meant by we just conduct the piece. And it was when I worked with Mazur, he said, but Viswa, what do you think Beethoven is trying to say? What do you think he's trying to do? What's the story he's coming up with? You have to come up with that. You don't necessarily tell the orchestra, but you have to come up with the drama and the pulse and somehow get people to care about it like you do.
As I hear each of you talk about what this means to you, and thank you so much for being so open with that and allowing us to step into your world in that space. I think for audiences, that's not something that that audiences get to see and to experience, right? We get to, as Viswa said, we get that punch in the gut, we get to experience the beauty on stage, but the process of being in that, the playing with the music, becoming really in tune with the music. And as you all were talking, really what came up for me around this is that it sounds like for the three of you, at least, it's this liberated space, right? It's this space of liberation for you. And so that in the context of this conversation too, it makes me wonder, how does your race and gender come into play? Does it come into play in a meaningful way? Does it not at all? Is it, you know, that I'm walking into the room as Alejandra the Latina, or that I can just come into the room being Alejandra without anything else attached to it? Is that a part of it at all for you as you're going into that?
I find that the minute the work starts, that all goes away. All the, you know, who you are, where you're from, or what you look like, what your gender is, it really does go away. So I think maybe for, I don't know, I can't speak for my colleagues, but you know, like, it just seems like that you both love this as much as I do, and that maybe part of why I do it is because that is a moment when you're just a pure being, like there's nothing attached to you. I mean, if things are going well, and then all the society's preconceived notions of, you know, who you are, how, you know, what, you know, what you prefer, what your life choices are, goes away. That you're just this, like, I think Viswa was saying this at the very beginning, you're just this vehicle, you know? And like Kazemi said the same thing, right? You're just this vehicle for the work, for your colleagues, for the music. That's it, right? It's nice to be judged only on that, or not judged at all. It's very liberating, as Alejandra, as you said.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Judith, for sharing your thoughts on that. And I think there is, yeah, I mean, I think for anybody being able to come into a space without a feeling of judgment to do your work and be judged solely on your work, I think is probably true of most of us, right? In any profession that we're in, and desiring that. So thinking around these joyous and liberated spaces, and I'm now going to start calling them, what, if you can put your finger on it, you know, what have those spaces looked like? What has been in place in order for you to walk into those rooms and be able to cut everything else out and really just focus on the music making? Or what have been some really proud achievements where you've really felt that throughout the life of the work and the piece that you've been working on?
It's like going back and thinking about your kids, you know, like which ones did I like the most? It's, you know, it's funny. One of the most meaningful things I've ever done is one that it was musicians with, like, musicians from, you know, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, working with this orchestra in India. And, you know, there were maybe 6 professionals in the entire orchestra. Everyone else were doing other jobs, and they just loved making music. And the entire goal was to try and break down those walls of, you know, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. You know, would I say the quality of that performance was as great as, you know, what I conducted the French National Orchestra? No, but the meaning of that moment, and having a horn player look at me and say, you know, this is the first time I've ever performed in a group that all looked like me, was amazing, you know? So I think I define it for me in different ways. You know, I think the quality of what we do, or the moment, is different depending on the situation as well.
That's wonderful. Well, and to be able to, in what you said to Viswa, what I heard is that, again, it speaks to being in that space. You can put aside whatever these conflicts, real or perceived, are within a space, right? And just be able to be in community and be in community with each other through the art making, which is really a special thing that happens when any group of artists come together to build and to create something.
I had a recent experience. This is actually right in the pandemic, and it was October of 2020, and the world was starting to lock down, and I was engaged to do a production of Don Quixote in Hong Kong. So there was so many challenges, right? There was the first place, I think, one of the first places in the world where you had to be in quarantine for 14 days. That was absolutely necessary. So I had to do it. I had to be in quarantine, and then I had all these colleagues that we've been basically locked down for so long. And when we finally got to the performance, it was really lovely. All of a sudden, like, I think these are guys who work all the time, like nonstop. It's a repertoire company, nonstop. And we actually were nervous. It was like we hadn't performed. It's like we don't do tons of performances every year. And that was so special. I think that was all the efforts that we went through, all the precautions, all the tests that we had to go through, and I think we were all very moved by the end of that experience.
That is fantastic. Kazem, from you, any experiences that come to mind?
I mean, I've had so many really wonderful musical experiences, and I guess just as I go forward, like anytime I have the chance, because it really is an honor and a privilege to be able to conduct. And so I always just think, oh, you better make it good, because like you might drop dead tomorrow. So do your best. You might not wake up tomorrow. I don't know. There is a little bit of that always kind of in my mind. I don't know. It's kind of morbid, but that's sometimes what I do think. Better be good.
I agree. 100%.
Know what you're talking about.
That's well, assuming that you will be here tomorrow, let's continue to take our steps forward then, Kazem. And so I'll start with you because you ended us on that, right? So let's look forward. I mean, I kind of want to say, pandemic aside, and you can choose to either include this in your response or not, but I mean, what does the future of opera and classical music look like for you? What is it that you want to see as you keep moving forward in your career and in this art form? What do you want the generation that comes after you to experience and to do and to see?
I guess for me, I would like to see opera companies opera companies and orchestras both, to think that different people can express and work with music of different cultures, like in the same way that someone like Beverly Seals and the conductor that was I can't remember his name at the moment, the one, yeah, I just know that she commissioned Malcolm X back in the 80s. And yeah, this was a white Jewish woman that saw the drama that could happen in this particular opera. And she had a conductor that was also not Black, and they made it a success when they did it back in that time. I'm not able to remember his name at the moment. I'm so sorry. I'm coming up blank on who the conductor was that did that particular opera, but I only mention it just because I'm going to be working on this opera next season. And I think that also goes the other way, that that an Indian conductor, a Black conductor, an Asian woman can conduct Rosenkavalier. They can conduct Bruckner and Mahler and all of these things, and there won't be a lack of musical intellect, musical expression, understanding of the style, and all of these things that that people will try to maybe get away. Yes, and of course, there's always something natural. Of course, if you're like a native-born Italian speaker, a native-born German speaker, you have there's a certain depth of understanding of a text in opera, or maybe understanding of a tradition that does exist for sure. But at the same time, other voices can bring another perspective or point of view on that can be just as deep and just as profound.
That's actually you've hit on a question that's come up, two of them that have come up around this issue of pigeonholing, which Viswa, you spoke to, right? But one of the questions being that, you know, these operas that tell the story of BIPOC individuals or communities, do they have to be performed only by BIPOC conductors? And I think, Kazem, what you're saying is that what you'd like to see is that we're mixing it all up in every way.
Yeah.
That is there, I mean, for Judith and Viswa to add to this, I mean, is there, you know, is there something to the conversation around people of color have so rarely been given the opportunity to tell their own stories that please just give us a chance to do it. And I'll use one of my favorite examples of this, right, is West Side Story. Is, you know, here you have a story about Puerto Ricans, and rarely have Puerto Ricans been put in the title roles to be able to perform it. So, you know, at what point is that necessary? Let me start there. Is it necessary? Is it necessary to do it until we can get to the point where we're really mixing things up? How does this relate to opera and what's going on today?
I mean, I agree with Kazem in that I would love to see us reach that point, but I think until we reach that point, I think if the only vehicles for BIPOC performers right now are going to be minority roles and minority operas, you know, then they should be the first people cast to do them. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want that to forever be the case, but I also want people to have access to being able to be on stage and work. You know, I have a mortgage, I have to pay it, you know. I would love to be able to say that I can turn down every minority opera from here on out and only focus on doing, you know, like I would love to do Bruckner. I would love to do a Bruckner symphony somewhere, you know, but I can't. Like I financially cannot do that for myself. You know what I mean? So I have to be more selective, and I can be more selective, but I'm also going to take work at the right places when it's the right time, even if it is something that I feel like is continuing to pigeonhole me. And I think that's just the pragmatic side of it. And I think if we reach the point where we were agnostic in how we cast, and, you know, we could have, you know, any role played by the right voice and not necessarily like having to pigeonhole them by race, then great, then let's do that. Until then, you know, I have got friends who need work and they're not getting A Marriage of Figaro, so they're going to go sing, you know, the minority opera. So it's the reality of the situation. It's like our discussion of moving away from fossil fuels. Well, until we can get to the point, we have to slowly wean ourselves off of gas. We can't turn the pipe off tomorrow. You know, we're not there yet. We're moving that direction. So it's a little bit like that, I guess.
Judith, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
You know, that's a challenging question. I can't help it. I don't know if it has to do with the fact that I'm spent the first 9 years of my life in Hong Kong, where it's very cosmopolitan, very multicultural. I think they came up with the word multicultural before anybody else did, simply because it was that kind of an environment. And meritocracy was very much part of that. Whoever is, so I can't help it. I don't know, it's probably not the best answer, but I've always been obsessed with the beautiful voice, right? You cast who's the best. But that's a tricky answer, because, you know, that does not always happen, right? So, I mean, because so no, I actually, in all honesty, don't have a good answer for that. It's something I'd have to really think about further. It's hard, because you, as you know, as Viswa was saying, you want to give the opportunity, because without opportunity, artists can't grow. So if it means that someone has to take, you know, a particular engagement because I got lucky, because the rules of the grant says that you must be fit these diversity boxes in order to get this opportunity, but how else is that young artist or artist, career on the way up, how is it they can get that chance to work? And like going back to what both my colleagues are saying, this is not the kind of work that you could just sit there at home and look at a book and go, right. Okay, and all of a sudden, you're singing Cavaradossi. It's just not. You have to do it. You have to take the opportunity, even if it isn't Puccini at the time, because it will help, eventually in the future.
Well, it sounds like a real push and pull, right, between what you all are saying. I go back to your statements here around wanting to just be artists and to do the job that you're hired to do and want to do. And I say the push against representation in our art form, right, of seeing a story of a person of color being told by white folks, right? People who are not or let me also just say, like, people who are not from that culture, right? And so kind of seeing that and saying, well, wait a minute, here I am, a person of that culture, and you have somebody who is completely misrepresenting what that is before me. And yet, if you, and Viswa and Kazem, I think you both have really spoken to this, right? If you continue to step into those roles, then you get pigeonholed, and then you're only constantly doing those. But you also want to be able to, like, go in to represent the culture that belongs to you, right? So, like, it feels like there's this constant just pushing up against it. And so how, is it just that the tension's going to get to a point where it'll just explode? Or one of the questions was actually for you, Vish, was, do you have a strategy to break that cycle? How do we move past that point?
I mean, this is my brilliant agent whom I adore. And I really do, actually. I didn't mean that to sound sarcastic. I really do love my agent. But one of his new strategies is, like, it's a negotiation. It's like, he'll come in and do this, but you've got to guarantee down the road he's getting a Traviata or of Mozart, or if that's going to be what people want me to do, then they're going to have to make the commitment that down the road I get another shot at something else. In that way, the hope is that we can kind of start expanding and start pushing companies to say, okay, he can do, if he did this well, we're going to have to commit to bring him in to do something else.
Yeah.
It's
fantastic. Yeah. I mean, do you all see that as maybe a potential also word of advice to young artists to say, as you're looking for your trajectory and you want to think about kind of what comes next, and you step into one role, here's how you can kind of help other people see where your potential is, right? Because I think we humans are really bad at being able to see other people's full potential, right? We see them as we've met them in that space. So how can an artist advocate for themselves to say, here's where I think I can go, here's how you can help me get there?
Yeah, I think that comes back to the whole showing up. You just have to show up, and the more you show up, the more people are going to think it's totally normal, right? I think it comes down to that. Also, I mentioned before, I was very lucky. I had wonderful, wonderful supportive mentors. And also, I think it's important to have an exceptional manager who understands you, who supports you, who has a lot of experience, who could guide you the right way. Because there are times, even, if you've been in the business for a long time, you can't see, because this is about you, or it's all me, and you can't see clearly of the 20 steps ahead. And that's where people who are supportive of you, whether it's your mentor or your manager, that's how, that challenge can be broken.
Yeah, that's great. So for our audience who's tuning in today, we'll continue to take your questions. So please use that Q&A button. Some have come in, and we'll get to those in just a few moments. But please submit your questions, and we'll launch into that in a moment. But I want to turn it back to the panel, and we've talked and addressed a lot the artists, the young artists, I'm curious about what you'd want the audience to know too about what you see as your role that might be unseen to them, and what you want for the future of the art form, right? Still looking at this kind of future vision of what's to come next. What's the audience role in that? What should they know about that? And how are they players in that? Judith, I don't know if you have any thoughts in that regard.
Oh, yeah. I think audience is our 50% partner in everything that we do. I think we've all noticed in this year, season and a half of pandemic, where most of us had to perform to no one, really. I mean, they're out there in cyberspace or whatever, but we were not allowed to. And there is something that is so kind of slightly, the magic is still there, but it's not as amazing as having the audience right there sharing, you know, the sound molecules, sharing the space. I hope that the audience continue to support this incredible art form. I mean, but also new works. New works, I think, are so important. It's a gamble, and gambling is you know, can be very exciting, especially if you win. And so we need to support. I think, you know, one of the most incredible experiences, and I will remember forever, actually, was An American Dream. It was so, in every way, it was so perfect an experience. We were talking about experiences before. So I think support new works, but on the other hand, please, I beg you, don't cancel Verdi and Puccini and Beethoven, right? We need the balance. I know now, you know, perhaps now we're so aware of all sorts of issues that are in the world, and that's a wonderful thing. And there are times, and being in the business that we are, of course, you know, we can be a little conservative. Right now, I know it may seem like we're overcorrecting, but it is necessary. It will balance out again. I think it's an incredible art form, and in this day and age where you're not allowed to do anything anymore, right? You in polite company, right? You can't have anything high caloric. So you got to come to the opera, right? You got illicit passion, true love, you know, murder, right? That's a really exciting place to be. And I know you can have that on Netflix. However, this is live right in front of you. So that would be my message to our wonderful audience.
Yeah. Well, let's you opened the door, so let's dig in a little bit around, you know, not canceling the Verdi and the Puccini, and Viswa, you've been candid about this too, right? Of the don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need our butterflies and our lakmes and our magic flutes, as problematic as they are. You know, so talk more about that. Why is it important to keep that there? And knowing what we know today, right? Knowing that these things really weren't acceptable back then. They just didn't have the language and the words around it, and they're definitely not acceptable now. How do we, and by these things, I mean issues of sexism, racism, oppression that come up in these works, misrepresentation of people and culture, you know, how then can we approach it? How can we understand how do we honor the beauty of these works, and yet bring our current lived experiences to them?
I think this is where it's incumbent on companies to open the door to a wider variety of voices producing these works, right? You know, I would love to work on operas set in India. You know, as weird as it may sound, I would love to do a Lakme. I'd love to be in a room from the very beginning of the discussion to talk about how we deal with some of the problems in the show. You know, because not everything has to be that way. I mean, if you really look at Tosca, Tosca is kind of a really feminist opera. Here's a woman who's making the strongest decision she can make each time she's given a choice to try and save the most people in her life. You know, it's not a jealous woman who's fickle, if you really look at it. You know, the jealousy is a playful moment between her and Cavaradossi, and I think it's the thing that you do when you're completely in trust with somebody. And that's what the music is saying. But we've always portrayed her as this kind of jealous, fickle woman and who got herself in this situation when really she's just trying to save people's lives. You know, and I think it's a different view of it if you don't come from the steep traditional view of how it should be done, right? And I think this is where having minority voices in the room is really beneficial, and having outside voices in the room is beneficial, you know? And I think contextualizing it for our audiences, right? Like we have to look back. I mean, St. Louis did this really well when they did Death of Klinghoffer. They started months in advance and had all kinds of symposia around it, brought in a bunch of religious figures to talk about, you know, Judaism, anti-Semitism, etc. And it was received really well. And then when the Met did Klinghoffer, I don't think they got ahead of it in time, you know, and there were protests outside the Met, right? It's just, I think a lot of it is about our companies taking the time to contextualize it for our audience and building an understanding that, yeah, these stereotypes were of an era and they're not good. You know, we're not trying to perpetuate it, but there's such brilliant music in this, and the universal side of these shows and the love story that's in it, or the story about tragedy, that is still relevant to us now, you know? Can I add one more thing though about the audience?
Yeah,
I would
please.
love to see our audiences hold us more accountable. We don't always deserve a standing ovation and 2 curtain calls. We don't. Sometimes you have a right to not stand. Sometimes when it's really great, you can cheer for 15 minutes. I would love to see our audiences hold us more accountable. Like I feel like there are times you go to a performance and it deserves a polite applause. It's okay. We're not great all the time. Push us harder. It's one of my favorite things about Europe. You know, like I remember at an intermission of an opera in Vienna, like all the audience was talking about how the conductor was a little off his game that day. And I was like, wow, you guys saw that he was, you know, it's fair. Push us harder. No one goes to a sporting event to see mediocre basketball, right? Like you don't. Do the same with us.
Yes.
Yeah. And can we reinstate it that it's okay to clap in between movements if we did a particularly good second movement? I hope so, right? Didn't they used to do that way back when? It's great for us, right? No, I'm in agreement. Yeah.
You know, I've seen those moments, Judith. I feel like when I've been in audiences that are very diverse, or audiences who are not accustomed to the traditions of an opera space, right? Those have been the spaces where I've been with an audience, and I love it, right? We're like, after the beautiful high note in the middle of the aria, they're already clapping and they're hooting, and you know, it's still going, but there's nobody around shaming them for doing those things. So I'm with you, Judith. I say let's get back to making some noise from the audience. And you all heard it here. Next time we see Viswa at Seattle Opera, don't stand.
Oh, you'll want to stand. I mean, you will.
Oh, there we go.
I'm just saying, when I work, I'm sure you're going to want to stand. But push us harder. You have every right to.
There you go. Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and I love your point too around the sports. And I often use sports as an analogy for as a singer. I use it for singers, right? I mean, it is a sporting event, right? I mean, everybody up there, even to the crew, I mean, they're not just like sitting back hanging out. I mean, they're working really hard. Everybody's working really hard. And when you see excellence, you want to respond to it. The same thing when you're watching, everybody watches the Olympics, even if we don't watch sports throughout the rest of the year or the rest of the 4 years before it's back on, but we surely we identify with those successful moments and those exciting moments. So we've got some really interesting questions in our Q&A that I want to throw at you all. One of our first ones here is from a conductor who identifies as white and wanting to go into a new space with a large number of musicians of color in a thoughtful way, really understanding their position in that space. Do you have any advice or thoughts to share about how this individual might think about how they walk into the space with majority instrumentalists of color as a white conductor? Not that any of you are white conductors, but.
I would just say hold everybody to the same standard.
Yeah.
And that's all.
Agreed.
And Judith, this question is specifically for you. Audiences often expect to see a male conductor on the podium. What are the challenges for you as a female, and the joys of being able to be at the podium, both as a woman and a woman of color?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm afraid I'm going to tell that story of Seoul in a very short moment. Okay, so I was in Seoul. I was making a debut with the Korean Symphony in the Pit and Korean National Ballet, and it was not a performance, but it was a press night. So all the press was there and all the important folks, because it was private. So my partner, Amanda, was sitting beside this very elegant gentleman, and she found out it was he was I think the French ambassador or something. It was like something straight out of Merry Widow. Anyway, so he sat there, and he actually at the intermission turned to her and said, do you know the conductor? And Amanda said, oh, yes, I do. And he said, what is his name? And she looked at him and said, her name is Judith Yan. So it's interesting being in the pit that really they see you twice, right? When you run out, right? And I'm short, so sometimes they don't even see that I'm a woman. When you come and take that first bow, they can see the top of my head, and that's about it. And then at the very end, when you walk out on stage, and I think my partner have said once that people gasp because I don't think they read the program well enough to know that I'm not a man. But the story with the experience with the French ambassador was that I think he had a nanosecond, right? He processed, recovered. Oh, fine. Watch the rest of the performance, the press call, and and I think for him it was just a shift. And I think the two of them just had the grandest time. Probably had champagne without me, but it didn't faze him at all. And I think I know people may react or they may not. I think the first time I was there, one of the major papers actually brought that to the attention. It was the first woman to conduct the orchestra or conduct for the company. So, but I don't really worry about it. I mean, I'm just here to facilitate, the process. That's all, and hope you have a good time.
Well, it sounds like you're speaking to that a little bit, and I think you said, I don't think you did say this, right, about showing up, and so you're changing perception by showing up and being in the space, and it's about changing that perception. Another question that we have for all of our panelists here is, how would you define success? And can you give examples of what you're most proud of or gratified by? So Kazem, I'll start with you. How do you define success? And what's an example of something that you've been most proud of or gratified by?
I guess I would define success when you have a team of people, like so I'll just stick with opera since this is an operatic platform. Like, when you have a team of people and you really all congeal and come together to give a great performance, and I would define that as success. And if there's box office appeal and box office success, that's even better.
Viswa, how about for you?
Oh, wow. It's funny. I mean, I think at the end of every performance, the only thing I remember are the things that went wrong. I'm too much of my dad's son in that one. But I agree with Kazem when it comes to a performance. Like, you kind of know it when it's done. Like, that there was the energy and the propulsion and the excitement in the right places and the audience, that's a success. A career success, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I'll ever feel successful. It's a constant journey, because my favorite moment when I was covering an assistant to Court Mazur, we were doing the Franck Symphony, and in the middle movement, there's an English horn solo, and he kept looking at the English horn player, asking him to play it a certain way. Finally, the English horn player got frustrated and said, "Maestro, there's no way, because the instrument breaks when you go through this fingering." And he said, "Ah, I see. That's why it hasn't worked for 29 years. And he was floating because on the way to the elevator to his dressing room, he and I were talking, and he looks at me and he says, Viswa, and he's 72 at the time, 74 at the time, had already conducted the Gewandhaus, had worked with the New York Philharmonic, and he looks at me and says, Viswa, I have to tell you, it's a great day when you learn something new. You know, and I think I think the conductors I admire are the ones who are consistently living that life, right? It's never, you don't ever really know a symphony. You don't ever really know the opera, no matter how many times you've conducted it. You know, there's a great video of Schulte conducting Beethoven 5, and he actually turns back 2 pages during the symphony and looks again at the score. It's actually a video in a performance. He flips back 2 pages and like he sees something that he hadn't seen before, and you see him kind of shake his head at himself. I mean, we're constantly pushing to find a better way, a better performance. So I don't know what success is. It's looking at the score again and learning something new.
That's excellent. Judith, how about for you? What does success look like?
Ooh. Yeah, it's very hard to define. I did love that story of Viswa you gave about that wonderful orchestra of all these different groups that got together and how meaningful that was for you. I think I would definitely define that as a tremendous success. I think it's, you know, whatever group you're working with, no matter how big the budget, you know, it's wherever you start, at the end of the process, we hope that it is here. So, you know, so funny way, like if you're driving a 1980s Chevy, okay, Chevette, right? And you win the Indy, you know, the Indy with it, that is success, right? That's tremendous success. Now, if you were driving a Ferrari, well, you know, then that is not as great a success. So I think it's how much improvement you take from the beginning of the project to the end and what the materials you have to work with. Mm. I think that's very meaningful. And I think no matter what the level of the organization or how much the budget is, it's everyone defines in a way success from that point of view. Like I may be, you know, or so-and-so may be the most incredible French horn player, but my goodness, like this particular performance, he or she took it up, you know, 5 levels. I think that's what an individual success is. And you really hope, as Kazem had said, that we all feel like that at the same time, because there are times when, you know, half your team is like, oh, that was the worst show ever. And the other half is like, my gosh, that was the greatest performance of my life. Please, you know, like, this is it. I want it to be like this. I want it to end now. And so, yeah, success is hard to define.
Yeah, it certainly is. But I do love what you said, Judith, and I love that you've allowed the context and the resources to be a part of that definition, right? I think one of the things, and I am just projecting my own thoughts onto all of this, but I think one of the things that sometimes can become a burden on our art form is this projection that everything has to be at the highest level of the most prestigious, most, you know, well-resourced, well-trained, and if it isn't that, then it's no good. And that is, boy, that does all of us a disservice. It's not just a disservice to all the other art form. It does all of us a disservice because then we miss out on beautiful artistry that is showing up in different ways, and in being able to see and view success that is being measured in different ways or happening in ways that we're unaccustomed to. So I really appreciate you adding that to your definition. Our final question that we have here is, it's a bit of a big one for us to end on. And again, this is not a space where we have concrete answers or a space where we have definitive answers. But we have a question from one of our viewers around what kind of insights you all might have around a work, for example, like the Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado, on how to address a show like that, how to be able to still perform something. And we talked on it already, so, you know, feel free to repeat some of the things that you've said if there's nothing new to add specifically for this piece, or if you're not terribly familiar with it. But with a piece like Mikado, which is a pastiche of a culture, of a real true culture, as created by people not from that culture, right? So then what do we do with something like that? How do we walk into a work like the Mikado and do justice to the culture, to the real culture that it represents?
Well, I wonder about Mikado. I don't know Mikado at all, but I imagine is the caricature, all right, of the characters that's problematic. And I can speak from my experience as an Asian, person who was born in Hong Kong, that it is also in our tradition to have cartoon caricatures, often of our own culture. Now, however, that's created by my own people, so that's different. I can't speak for Mikado, but I can add a very short thing about Butterfly. And there seems to be a lot of criticism against, Butterfly, should we do it? Oh, Puccini, terrible. But I never, and anyone I've ever been spoken with about Butterfly never experienced it as racist. I personally don't think that Puccini is racist, or I think he's just reporting the truth, right? This and it's hard. And I, as an Asian person, I can tell you those experiences are real, right? That what he is saying is exactly true. Now, Mikado, I don't know, but
I actually conducted a production of Mikado. It was a favor to a friend. And I have to say, they tried really hard to figure out ways to do it. They worked with the Japanese Cultural Association to figure out ways to be more thoughtful about how they produced it. So they produced it as a play within a play, and it was the final dress rehearsal. No one was in full costume in that sense, or you know what I mean? So they were trying to play it and they created a Gilbert character who would be on the God mic, trying to help staging and redo some things and blah, 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 right? And I don't know that necessarily it was successful in solving the problems, because the gesture was still very caricature-y, and they were trying to recreate the world premiere performance of Mikado. So that gesture and that kind of characterization was still problematic to me. But I think what was really fascinating was the audience reaction was such that they were so angry that they didn't see the Mikado that they knew and the Mikado that they wanted to see. So I think this is also one of those places where the audience has to kind of help us out a bit, because it is a problematic work, and it really is. I mean, having worked on it, having been in it, the character is kind of offensive. But, yes, I know that it wasn't meant to be that. It was a caricature of the English society at the time, blah, 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 but it still comes off as an Asian caricature. And I think when a company is really trying to figure out how to be more thoughtful about the production, an audience has to kind of help us along too, and understand that we're trying to be more thoughtful about these productions. We're trying to allow this music to come forward in a way. And it may not look exactly like the old show you used to see, and that is kind of the point. So it's a little bit of give and take between us and the audience on that. It was a tough piece to work on, because I don't know that we got it right, but I admire the company for doing their best and collaborating with people who were Japanese, who were part of the Japanese Cultural Association, to really kind of give us a sense of a different way to look at the piece. They tried. I don't know that it worked, but I admire any company for taking on a work like that, but really trying to be more thoughtful and collaborative about producing it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. I mean, that is certainly a difficult piece to take on, and it's thank you also for sharing the audience perspective, because that's a really, really big piece of it. And I think we also have to be okay with some people not liking it. I think that's one of the things, again, where we do ourselves a disservice, right? Of we love this art form so much. We want everybody to love it. We want everybody to love every single piece of it. The reality is that there are some folks for whom Mikado is never going to be their thing. Butterfly is never going to be okay with them. And I think, I'm speaking here with my administrator hat on, our job is to contextualize it, to say, here's here's where it came from, here's where it sits now, here are all the different perspectives on it, here's why we're choosing to do it, and then allow folks to say, no way, not for me, or to really fall in and fall in love with it, but really allowing for those spaces. So that was a good meaty question to end our time together on. I want to thank each of you so much for joining us in this conversation. You have been really courageous and vulnerable and have shared so much of yourselves throughout this past almost hour and a half together. You've exemplified what quote from Brene Brown, having a strong back and a soft front. So thank you very much for showing up in this space with us. I also want to say thank you to the folks who are working behind the scenes today. Chris Burkett, who is making sure that the audience can see us via Zoom in this webinar and recording it for it to be posted later. Alex Minami, who's managing the chat and fielding questions for me. And a huge thanks to Alex and Gabrielle Nomura Gaynor, whom I have the honor and privilege to work with in coming up with these community conversations. I learned so much from these two incredible folks every time we have these conversations, and I'm just eternally grateful to both of them. Thank you to our audience who was listening today. I hope that the conversation has inspired you or provided you with new perspectives to further your own learning. And I hope that you will all continue to join us for future Seattle Opera events. If you are not in Seattle, go see art in your area, please. Stream it, see it in person, plan to see it in person when it's back in person. Of course, we're all artists. We believe it's a great unifier and it makes our lives richer, but please continue to come and see us. Again, thank you so much, Judith, Viswa, and Kazem. So grateful to each of you and for having you spend some time with us today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.